Hi, everyone. In this second part of the lecture, I want to introduce more precisely and clearly what some features are of the so-called tone, pitch, accent, and intonation languages. That is how we can potentially distinguish them from one another. So we'll begin with tone languages. Approximately half of the world's languages, in fact, have some kind of lexical tone, which can mean two things at the same time. So on the one hand, this may mean that phonological information in the lexical entries of most, perhaps all morphemes has to be specified for tone. And it probably also means that at least two different contrastive tones need to be underlyingly specified. So this would mean there would need to be, say, at least contrast between a high tone and a low tone relative to one another. They're complicating this picture. As we'll see, there are a number of different complications to discuss today. There are languages like Central Swedish, which probably have tonal information in the lexical entries of some morphemes, but they don't have any underlying tonal contrasts. So in the analysis of Central Swedish prosody, according to Riyad, their morphemes may be marked underlyingly for high tone, but there is no contrastive tone. So I would tend to think that it's the case that for the languages that we want to consider to be tone languages, both of these properties need to be true, though some people might be inclined to consider Central Swedish a tone language because some morphemes need to be specified as having some kind of tonal property. Now, a good example, a relatively clear example of a tone language is furnished to us by the language Ibibio. This is a Niger-Congo language spoken in Nigeria, where we can see minimal pairs that are distinguished solely by differences in pitch and syllables. So the word meaning, let's zoom in a bit here, the word meaning an expanse of ocean on its two syllables. Both of those syllables have a high pitch. So here we see a pitch line here, and we can contrast that with the word meaning a small ant species, which is segmentally identical, but we can see that the frequency here on both of these two vowels is lower. And if we contrast this with the word for first, again, segmentally identical to the words for expansive ocean and small ant species, we can see that the pitch on the first syllable is lower, somewhat more similar to the pitch on the vowels of the word meaning small ant species, whereas the pitch on the second syllable is higher, more similar in range to the pitch on both of the vowels in the word for expansive ocean. So we can see here that there is this contrast between high pitch and low pitch. Any given vowel may carry this difference between a high pitch and a low pitch, and it looks like this needs to be lexically specified. So just to make this clear here, the fundamental frequency is represented on the pitch track along with the spectrogram here, those blue lines. You'll notice also that there are, of course, as we saw in the example earlier here, there are lots of gaps in the pitch track, and those gaps occur mainly in periods of voicelessness. So pitch is somewhat clearer here on this recording. And when there's voicelessness, of course, the vocal cords are not vibrating and no pitch can occur acoustically. You'll notice, interestingly, in at least the word for expansive ocean, also in the word for first, this is clear, that this labiovelar stop becomes slightly voiced as it releases into the following vowel. And the result is that there is some pitch, but the pitch produced in that period we can consider to be non-phonological. We can see that it's, in fact, considerably higher than any of the real phonological pitch, which is aligned with the vowels. And in terms of the transcription of pitch using the International Phonetic Alphabet, we see high pitch transcribed here with an acute vowel, and low pitch transcribed with a grave. And as I said, it seems relatively clear that Ibibio, given this minimal triplet, contrasts for at least two lexical tones. Similarly, Mandarin Chinese exhibits four contrastive lexical tones, and using the syllable ma, we can see this set of contrasts. So here are the words themselves, the words for mother, hemp, horse, and the verb scold, which I've transcribed using diacritics. So these would be a high tone, a rising tone, a low tone, and a falling tone. The traditional terms in Chinese linguistics are the first, second, third, and fourth tones. I've also given here a description of the approximate properties. And one alternative besides diacritics on the vowels for transcribing pitch is to use these tone letters. These are also made available in the International Phonetic Alphabet, and both can be used. It's possible to place these tone letters either before or after the syllables involving them. The usual practice, or maybe the more common practice, is to place these tone letters following the vowel. That contrasts with the marking for stress, which we saw last week, that the indications for stress are always placed before the segments belonging to the syllable carrying that stress. And when we come to the following section of this lecture, we'll talk about the phonological representation of tone in more detail. Come now to intonation languages, because we'll leave pitch accent languages for last because they're somewhat more complex to describe. Now, in intonation languages, the sole source of phonological pitch is information structure or some kind of related semantics. In intonation languages, the lexical entries of morphemes do not carry in information about tone. When I say information structure here, what I mean is that this refers to how either known or unknown pieces of information are packaged in a sentence. That is how information is structurally organized within the context of the larger discourse. So this could mean adding new information if you start talking about something that was not already present in the discourse, or if you want to mark some information, say a topic, as something that was already present and known, or very often this information structure can carry some information about the whole sentence itself, whether we're making a statement, asking a question, expressing surprise, and so on. And in this way, pitch patterns, which we will refer to as tunes, in intonation languages seem to behave like morphemes because they appear to express some semantics that are not expressed anywhere else in the sentence. So here, intonation as a whole refers to the particular pitch changes that are introduced by information structure at the level of the phrase or even at the level of the whole utterance. And all languages seem to have intonation in this sense. So also tone languages like Ibibio or Mandarin can have intonation in the same sense, but when intonation is the only clear source of phonological pitch in a language, then we will classify that language as an intonation language. And we'll see this in more detail using English in section 3 of today's lecture. Our third category, the category of pitch accent languages, is rather difficult to precisely define because to some extent, these languages often look rather stress-like in the sense that maybe just one syllable per word can be identified as prominent. So there's just one syllable per word, which is allowed to or must have some type of tone. And on the other hand, both prominent and non-prominent syllables in such languages seem to be characterized by the presence of different tones that are not solely due to intonation. So very often in languages that are described as pitch accent languages, it looks like there is some prominent syllable marked by a high tone, and other syllables carry some other lower pitch. As we'll see, this sort of looks to be the case in Japanese. Often ancient Greek is described as a pitch accent language, and from what we can tell about ancient Greek, it exhibits those pitch properties. as well. A single high tone per word, other syllables seem to have a low tone. But in contrast to the stress languages and tone languages, it might be easiest or perhaps safest to define pitch languages as languages that are somehow defective. That is, languages that don't clearly have multiple underlying contrastive tones, unlike tonal languages, which need to have lexical contrasts in tone. And in contrast to stress languages, pitch accent languages often seem to lack one or more of the following properties. Obligatoriness, meaning that maybe a word, a phonological word does not have to have some most prominent syllable. Culminativity, perhaps a phonological word is allowed to have more than one most prominent syllable or several equally prominent syllables. Or they lack privativity, that is, there is not a clear contrast between just prominent and non-prominent elements, or metricality, that is the use of grouping of syllables into units in order to determine where the prominence should be placed. Tokyo Japanese, and indeed basically all dialects of Japanese, seems to represent a relatively clear example of a language that has pitch accent. In this language, phonological words have at most one most prominent syllable, but they do not have to have a most prominent syllable. So in contrast to English or Italian languages with clear stress, it's not necessary that a syllable have, that a phonological word have a most prominent element. And in this language, when we find a most prominent syllable, it will appear as having a high tone on the surface, and all of the other syllables in the phonological word will receive a low tone. And for the most part, it seems that the position of prominence is not determined by a kind of predictable rule. So there's no obligatoriness and probably no metricality, although the role of some rules in sometimes determining where high tones may be placed in Japanese is somewhat debated. So we can see how lexemes of Japanese are lexically specified for prominence with a minimal triplet. So I've marked prominence here using an asterisk following the prominent vowel. So the words for chopsticks, bridge, and edge show this contrast. The word for chopsticks has its prominence on the first syllable, the word for bridge on the second syllable, the vowel E, and the word for edge has no most prominent syllable. Now, in isolation, one thing that occurs is that the distinction between the words for bridge and edge is neutralized because the high tone can only be really realized if there is a fall to a low tone on the following syllable. So this means the word for chopsticks, using this example, we'll add the topicalization particle wa to all of these examples. The word for chopsticks will, since it has two syllables, will always show a high tone on that first syllable. But this contrast between the words for bridge and edge can emerge when we add this further syllable wa, where we will have the high tone on the syllable hi in the word for bridge, but no high tone whatsoever in the word for edge. So this shows us the word for edge lacks any high tone, indicating that obligatoriness is not a feature of phonological words in Japanese, whereas the other two words, the words for chopsticks and bridge, receive high tones because of their lexical specifications for prominence. And so perhaps the only real role of prominence in Tokyo Japanese here is to indicate where the different tones should be anchored. So in the kind of phonological view that I've taken here, the words are not underlyingly marked for tone, but they are underlyingly marked for prominence, and rules involving tone in the language attract the high tone to these prominent syllables, and all of the other syllables are automatically assigned low tone. Finally, one thing that seems to also distinguish Japanese and similar languages from languages like English or Italian is that In contrast to languages that that seem to clearly have stress, the most prominent element, the element with the high tone here in Japanese, is not really any louder or longer. The syllable with that high tone does not become durationally longer, and it doesn't become acoustically louder. And also in contrast to English, whereas for instance, unstressed vowels are subject to some kind of reduction, shortening, centralization. Other segments in Japanese don't seem to undergo any phonological processes because of the position of prominence. So this allows us to see some kinds of differences in behavior between prominence in a pitch accent language versus prominence in a language that has that can be described as having stress. Okay, now that we've briefly summarized the distinctions between tone, intonation, and pitch accent languages, in the next two parts of the lecture, we will look first more closely at tone languages and then at intonation languages.